what if an attraction at Disneyland goes from an attraction in people's minds to a certifiable work, a certifiable pop art masterwork? And it has.
That is Ken Bruce talking about Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks for joining me here on episode 246 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton, talking today with Ken Bruce, author of the awesome new book, Before the Birds Sang Words, all about the history of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and a lot more, including looking back at animatronics and Disney and Disneyland and so much more, including tiki culture and everything that led into such a classic Disney attraction. And it's challenging for me. I'm recording this on Thursday of last week, of course, after the big presidential election. And I just want to say, part of me went, do I wait? Do I still publish this? We recorded this Monday night. And my thought was, hey, if Ken and I talking about Tiki Room gives you a break from being concerned or sad or all of the feelings, then I think it's worth doing. So I really enjoyed talking with Ken. I hope this gives you a little happiness and that you check out his book, which I thought was great. And that's what I'm doing this for. That's what we're here for, is just to have good conversations between people about the subjects we love, like theme parks. So let's get right to it. Here is Ken Bruce. So my guest today is a two-time Emmy Award-winning director and storyboard artist who did story work on films like Toy Story 3, Up, and Shrek. He's also the author of the recent book, Before the Birds Sang Words, about the history of Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and much more, which I really enjoyed. It is a really cool, fun history book. It is Ken Bruce. Ken, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Dan, a delight. This is a subject that I love yammering on and on and on about. So thank you for the patience that you're going to give me as we move forward. And thank you also for actually reading my book.
Oh, of course. That's the minimum, That's the minimum thing I have to do. I read it cover to cover, and then today even was looking at it again to remind myself, and I really enjoyed it. I think I could start again and read through it again because there's just so much in there that I found interesting, and it's great. Hey, I will let you talk because that makes my job easy. And I'll just ask a few questions. I'll go sit down. It'll be good. But
you can take a bathroom break, get a full course meal.
Dan disappeared. Where did he go?
Yeah, exactly. It's a subject I love yammering about. So yeah, you're in good company. You can be a little lazy tonight. I'm sure you'll get me going.
Never. I would never do that. But first, before we even dive into the book, I want to know a little more about your background with Disney, how you got interested in Disneyland, or just even, films, everything overall. Like, what got you interested in this when you were growing up, where you eventually led to where you wrote a book?
It starts with an incredibly sad, lonely life and a very insular kid who, no one paid attention to, who lived in the shadows. That's not really true, but it is kind of true. When we're the kid that's left alone, we dive into books and fantasy and escape. And animation, first of all, was a huge draw. Especially the Disney cartoons. I was the kid who was probably at age 7, 8, 9, was sure he was going to be in the animation field, and that it was going to be good animation, that stuff that the Disney people do. I knew what limited animation was, and I knew what Fred Flintstone looked like, but I also knew what Pinocchio looked like. And I knew that there was a difference, and I knew I wanted to be a part of that good thing. There was something so transporting and magical about animation. So at a very young age, animation was it. And if you're into the Disney, thing, the link to Disneyland is very minimal. And I did not go to Disneyland a lot as a kid, but when I went, it was an event. It was an event that, that changed my brain waves completely. First trip was age 5. Age 7 was the next trip, and that was when I saw the Tiki Room for the first time. So, I move into animation, an amazing career, but, the people who put the theme park together, still a fascinating story. Brad Bird, who wrote my introduction, said precisely what I would share with you, which is that idea of like going to Disneyland and being enchanted, being totally transported, being overwhelmed with pageantry and magic tricks that you believed in, so to speak. But then as you get into art school and move forward in your career, it becomes a passion for figuring it out, understanding how these people actually did that. The art of magic making, or what was it that Brad said? The art of cultivating wonder. That's a job that people have. How they do it became the next fascinating story for me. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Yeah.
So you mentioned too that you kind of went into animation and everything else. How important? It's kind of an obvious question, but how important were the Disney animated films and just everything and getting to your choice of career where you ultimately ended up working in this field with animation and everything else?
That's a question that's, on a primal level, when I'm a child, something about the Disney animated films, the color, the character, the exaggerated movements, the fact that this was an alternate reality, the fact that many of the Disney cartoons were beyond that, selling magic, selling fantasy, selling escape, just surreal images. It's those images, it's the color in the images that from a very young age just captivated me. And then, of course, as you get older, you start to understand the storytelling and the character and the movie making of it, because I'm also an avid film fanatic. So yeah, I think a lot of it is primal. I think a lot of it is that aha of the magic of it. That this is otherworldly. These are characters that came out of someone's imagination. These are moving drawings. So yeah, that sort of stuff. And then then it's like I have to be a part of it. But now my career has been all over the place. I've been everywhere. And I did work at the Disney Studios, but only on an ill-fated project that didn't go anywhere. But I was at Pixar for a couple of years as well, and DreamWorks and Nickelodeon and Warner Brothers. So like I think most people in animation, we hop around, but it's always been animation, and it's a career that I look back on today. I'm still doing it, but I still look back on a handful of years. And, it's a fun ride. I got to work with some amazing, talented people who were also in the business of making magic.
Yeah, and I have to mention it because you brought it up when you reached out, but that at some point you worked as a cast member on Horizons, not the design of Horizons, but working there, which I have to ask you about as it being my favorite attraction, basically. So you worked there. So tell me a little about that.
How great of you to say that it was your favorite attraction. So So when the Epcot project was announced, I was all about it. I was a young kid who was like, oh my God, another theme park that is utterly different than anything we've ever seen before, certainly that I'd ever seen before. And it made sense, Future World and World Showcase. And I followed it, and I was such a nerd about it. I was like actually writing letters to Coca-Cola and Kraft and, Siemens, like sponsors of these attractions. And again, I was a kid just wanting to know Like, send me everything, whatever. Like, I know you're sponsoring this attraction. What have you got for me? Send it. And they did. Like, these companies were like, they sent me all sorts of great information. So I was following that project for forever. Where I grew up in Palos Verdes, no longer there, but they had Marineland, and that was my first theme park gig. And I thought, well, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to find a way to work at Epcot when it opens in 1982. And I did. So 1985, 1986, no, 1984 and 1985, I was just a cast member. And I could go on a long tangent there, but I was like determined to work there. And they were like, all we can really offer you is like you're not going to like working at Epcot. You're going to be standing on a belt ride, which means having in your party as they hop onto a moving belt to get into an attraction. And I was like, I don't care. I want this. And I know a lot about the park. And I started rattling off like research that I had done, blowing them away with like, yeah, he knows a thing or two about people who put this together. So I was a major dork nerd who was weirdly fearless. And they actually offered me, they're like, you want to work at the Jungle Cruise? We'd like to put you on the Jungle Cruise. You don't want that? You still want Epcot? Well, how about if we put you on the Tiki Room? And I'm like, no. No, how about the railroad? And it wasn't until I was like halfway into like having in your party that someone came up and I told them that they had offered me that job. And they were like, you didn't take it? Apparently the 3 jobs that they offered me were the most sought after for cast operators, for ride operators, but it went right over my head because I had to be a part of Epcot. So 2 of the attractions I worked at, Horizons and World of Motion, and I went on, I was the guy who walked through behind the scenes when no one was looking, and I was also the guy that, like you, was like, this is really the best attraction they've ever made. It's gone now, but so well written, so well crafted. It was the ride that kept going. Like, holy cow, this is a long track.
Yeah.
The 3-act structure, how transporting it was, how that was the first ride to put you right smack in the middle of an omnisphere and wrap you around in film. Again, see, Dan, you got me going again. So
that's okay. I'm going to let you go on that for a minute. I promise we'll have enough time on the book. I got to mention it though. So, and Jungle Cruise Skipper, I've talked to people that are like, my whole goal in life was to be a Jungle Cruise skipper. And you didn't know. Some people are like dedicated.
It to me, and I'm like, no. Because I was so giddy and
you had the personality, yeah.
At the time, I guess I exuded this like, he can yap to people as a Jungle Cruise skipper. So no, I said no to that. No regrets, because I got to walk behind the scenes of World of Motion and Horizons, and again get another peek at like, oh, this is how they do it. So yeah, I was one of those having in your party people. Yeah, at both of those.
A lot of people are probably really jealous, but hey, let's dive into the book because I know there's plenty to talk about with the Tiki Room, and
let's do it.
There's so much to cover, but first of all, I just have to add, you mentioned them offering Tiki Room everything, but I'm curious what it was for you about. Because you met on the website, it says it took you 10 years working on this book, getting it together. What was it that made you want to do this about the Tiki Room? Like that interested you to be the subject of such a research detailed book?
Well, first of all, I'm going to push back a little. It was 10 years of research and 6 years of writing. So 16 years total.
Oh, wow.
People are like, do you have another book on you? Yeah. And it'll come out on, when I'm in my deathbed. So why invest that much on the Tiki Room? Well, it was the book that I'd always wanted to read. It was an attraction I knew was the most consequential at the park. It changed everything. Again, you can say I like, the Haunted Mansion or Rise of the Resistance better. There are more technologically advanced and showier and far more complicated shows at the park that exude more warmth and awe. But the Tiki Room changed everything, and it is the most consequential. And we wouldn't have Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion and Small World and Lincoln and America Sings and Horizons had that attraction not come about. The first of its kind, the first push button automated show where the characters, the lighting, the animation, all recorded and played back. It was huge. And not only did it change Disneyland technologically, but it changed the park from a sense of what it was, from a tone standpoint. Disneyland was still struggling to figure out what it was. And once the Tiki Room came out, it was a heck of a lot clearer to understand where we go from here and what we are capable of. And that, along with some other, say, Mark Davis related attractions, those were the things that introduced fantasy and put a big smile on the face of Disneyland. So it changed everything. It changed the history of Disneyland, but the history of an entire industry overnight. And it blew people's minds. So I wanted to take people back and remind them of its importance. But again, reeling way back, it was the book I'd always wanted to read. I'd always, for decades, wanted to read a deep dive into that attraction. Because again, I knew how important it was. And it felt like people need to understand how important it was. So when the opportunity came to, when I stumbled upon the first cachet of research material, totally accidentally, I was like, you know what? I guess it's my book to write because no one is writing it. I told someone recently, I told you I was going to not shut up. I had an out-of-body experience recently where I had my book in my hand, and again, just for a brief millisecond or two, I was like, oh my God, thank God someone wrote a book about that. Oh, I guess I did. It's like, I guess I wrote it. So yeah, it was an attempt to remind people of how important this attraction is. And a kind of a central question, which I think which I kind of discovered only recently, which is, it's a what if. What if an attraction at Disneyland goes from an attraction in people's minds to a certifiable work, a certifiable pop art masterwork? And it has. It is worthy of a museum. So what happens when with the idea being that Disneyland is not a museum, and you'll hear that from executives, it's like, we're going to keep changing and go away. We know what's right. To what if you do have something there that is utterly museum worthy and should not be tampered with? I don't have an answer, but I have a book that argues that the Tiki Room is in fact absolutely a pop culture masterwork. It's a piece of art.
Wow, you raised so many additional questions that I hadn't, but I can do this on the fly, Ken. But I agree with you. I love the Tiki Room. I love it more now than I did as a kid, which I think maybe I just appreciate it more knowing some of the stories. And I think your point, though, about its importance is really good, but also about it being a work of art, because we've seen other versions of the Tiki Room, California, not really, but in Florida and Tokyo still has different versions, and not to veer us into too much of that side of it. But when you see how it's done, and I still feel like Disneyland with the pre-show and everything is just so strong and everything, and it's smaller, and that's great. But up front, I'm going to go back to your point about stumbling on the research. I want to know more about that story, because how did that happen where you how do people like me, I don't just stumble upon this research. How did that happen?
I stumbled upon, it was like stumbling upon the treasure cache in the Pirates of the Caribbean, in the caverns. Well, I was working at Pixar. I've told this story before. I was working at Pixar and working on Up, the movie Up with Pete Docter. Now, Pete Docter is a rock star there now. He was a rock star there now, but he's kind of a deity there. He's running the company. He's the top creative executive. So, but back then we were working on Up, and he always did a yearly luau, kind of a Polynesian themed thing around his pool. And he invited me, and I was there, and Pete grabs me and he says, Ken, I have someone you need to meet. You will really hit it off with him or them. And I'm like, cool. I get to meet someone. And it was Kevin Kidney and his partner, Jody Daly. Didn't know them from a hole in the wall, but they are big wigs. Well, they're sort of their own company now, but they've done work on for cost, like they recently did the costumes for the new Country Bear show. They worked on designing parade floats and limited edition merchandise, and so they're amazing. So I started talking to Kevin, and he's also like me, a huge old school Disneyland nerd. And he started mentioning the fact that he also was a big fan of the Tiki Room, and I lit up because I was too. And he actually had collected over a good chunk of years, just out of passion, a whole bunch of Tiki Room ephemera that was, just for the fun of it, documents and elevation drawings and all sorts of stuff. And he had them all stuffed away on CD-ROMs or whatever. And he's like, Ken, I'm happy to, like, wow, it's great that I have found someone who would be as interested in this stuff as I am. And I was like, yes, I'd love to see it. Yay, yay. And he did say, but then he also said, I don't know what any use this is to anybody else. Maybe if someone were writing a book, this would be useful. And I was again, it was like a flash moment. It was, for me, the earth moved. I was like, that's the book I'd always wanted to read. Then it was like, starting with Kevin's material, I could launch a book project. Now, the material he gave me did not feed it was just the tip of the iceberg. So it was many other private archives later and, newspapers and private family stuff. But it was enough for me to get going. So I mulled it for the next 10 years and then said, I'm ready to go. And Kevin signed off and gave me his blessing. And that's what started it. So ultimately it was like, I have a launching point. By golly, this is the book I've always wanted to read. Like, I really, really, really wanted to read this story. So I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can even tell at the back of the book, you have your sources, and there's like 11 pages long of sources.
Yeah. Oh, that was even trimmed down because I only had a few pages to use. And I was like, and me and my editor had to cut a lot. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. You can tell there's so much information, and not just about the Tiki Room, about the history of animatronics and all that. Yeah. But you mentioned it up front, but this isn't a surprise to me, but it's when you go through the whole story, because like everything, we hear the same. You notice this with Pirates, Haunted Mansion. You reference in the book Griffith Park with the whole, that's how Disneyland started. And it's very simple, but the story with Tiki Room always seems to be, they show the shot of Walt with the animatronic. Yeah. They always show the bird, and they say it started with animatronics.
A little antique bird that he buys. Yeah.
And then they talk about the whole line about, well, you can't have the birds poop in the food, and that's like it. And I'm like, that's not even the reason. Yeah. But it's interesting. Were you surprised by a lot of what you found as you went through with the history, and as you went, did you have expectations that were changed a lot by it?
Oh yeah, I think the big discovery, and that's the fun of writing these books, is like you have an expectation of the story you're about to tell, but as you deep dive into the research, you realize there's a whole different story emerging, or lots of different stories emerging. But one of the key ones that bubbled up from the beyond was the pure Walt story. The fact that there was kind of an inevitability about the Tiki Room from Walt's childhood forward. Not literally, but kind of figuratively. It was discovering a different kind of Walt that I don't think has been covered in any other books. And it really starts with, kind of Walt as the nerd, Walt who wasn't allowed to have toys as a child because his father didn't believe in their value, but who also, while he was running his paper route at 4 a.m, would go up to a stoop and play with the toys that some other kid had left out, and then rush back onto the newspaper cycle. And how that's kind of human. That's a story that we all can tell about the things that we don't really get as a child, but that we chase after for the rest of our lives. And Walt was very much that. So Walt the nerd, Walt the guy who had something to prove, the Walt that was insecure, Walt that wanted to create his own art and especially his own art that reflected his own values, because the studio system was so overwhelming and didn't really reflect him. And then Walt, the person who is putting something together that is really close to his heart. This was a toy shop come to life. I would say in the book, if Disneyland's Main Street USA is a reflection of his beloved childhood memories, the Enchanted Tiki Room is a reflection of that very child who was able to, again, make a toy store come to life, and how powerful that was in Walt's psyche, and what a delight it was when he saw that project through to its end, and how he loved the Tiki Room and brought people in constantly for shows where he could watch their faces and surprise them and see their jaws drop. And boy, did people's jaws drop. We're used to it today, but in 1963, something like that had never been seen before. It was audacious and baffling, and for some kind of, and I'm going to use the word, but it's out there, kind of a spiritual experience. Like one writer equated it to, the first, walking into the first, European cathedrals, walking in a European cathedral for the first time. Yeah, that jaw-dropping experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, you referenced even in the book where people, when they were thinking about the restaurant, the whole idea that they were like, no one's ever going to leave. This is too fascinating. People are just going to, I mean, that's not the only reason, but that idea of just it being more than they even thought they were making in a weird way.
Well, yeah, and that was Walt through and through, because it's really important to remind people, and it's all there in the book. It was intended to be, the Tiki Room was intended to be a restaurant, and it was planned to be a restaurant for a good long time.
Yeah.
And the idea was that this was not going to be a quote unquote show. This was going to be a happening, kind of performance art. It was not meant to distract you too much from finishing your dessert. It was supposed to be kind of a lightweight animated reverie, a 3-act structure where the birds did not sing words.
Right.
They actually just tweeted out the numbers. There was no opening number. There was no MCs. It was just a happening. And of course, what happens over time is Walt asks for something and they deliver, but it's beyond his expectations. And over and over and over again, this thing grows because Walt sits there and goes, "Wow, you can do that. Well, if you can do that, we should do this." So it just kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder and more audacious, to a point where, and there's 2 prongs on this. Yes, it became something that Walt was convinced no one would want to leave. And if a restaurant was going to be a moneymaker, people had to leave. They needed to cycle through to the next dinner service, and they needed to do it quickly. But he was convinced, like, this is too good. We won't be able to we will have to, use a lift device and push them out the door because they're not going to do it. So, and then the other prong to that was the relationship he was having with the Stouffer's company, which was going to run the restaurant and had already started to run too, was not working out. So, Walt quietly thinks to himself, "Wow, this is also, if we turn this thing less into an experience and more into a full-blown show, we can do more shows and it might be more successful that way."
They also did something different, which I don't know if I realized with the ticketing, where I always had in my head, it was probably like, it was the highest level they had at the time. But I'd love to hear you talk about their decision to make it its own thing, almost like today. They have it its own thing in a way.
Well, there was no choice. Back then, the Tiki Room was made by Wed Enterprises. And Wed Enterprises was Walt's own company. It wasn't attached to the studio at all. This was made by Walt with money from his own pocket. So when the Tiki Room opened, and again, it was going to be, Stouffer's Present. So it was just the money situation was you paid for the meal, but part of that expense would then go to Imagineering, or WED at the time. Well, now that Stouffer's was out, the books had to be separate. So they actually had to sell, you actually had to buy a separate ticket at the front of the attraction, where Dole Whip is now, to see it. 75 cents adult. I think that's close to $10 now. So yeah, that was just to keep the books separate. Now, eventually they the studios and Imagineering were able to work out their financial differences and make it all work. But yeah, for the first year, I think at least for the first year, I have it written in my book somewhere. It was its own. You had to buy a separate ticket.
Yeah, and that was very successful, as you write about, right? That I mean, they
Yeah. Well,
huge.
that's tricky too because so much of the effectiveness of the Enchanted Tiki Room is based on surprise. Like, don't give anybody any spoilers. Let it be a surprise because it's one surprise after another after another. So, how do we get people in? Tell them enough about what this is without spoiling it. And again, no one had seen anything like it. So they want you to buy a ticket. They want you to know you're going to have a good time, but they also don't want to give away the store. So that was tricky. And that actually led to an animated bird out front that would tell people a little bit about what this thing was. And that helped for a while. But yeah, that's a tough proposition. But whatever. Ultimately, what really worked for that attraction was just good old fashioned word of mouth. Like, holy cow, you've got to see it. And that ultimately was what made the attraction in its first dawning months and years take off.
Well, I know we've already jumped to the Tiki Room and like the actual attraction and how it worked, but I know in the book you do a really good job of talking about the build up to what we've already talked about.
Yeah.
In a few different ways. So I wanted to ask you about Adventureland too, because in my head, I even picture Adventure like, oh, I know old Adventureland. And I'm probably thinking of what it was like 1980 something, or like, in the 70s, not what it was in 1960 or something. So what was Adventureland like before the Tiki Room was there, before even they started to go that direction?
Oh my God. That was fun. It didn't technically dead end, but it did. Like many of the lands there, you kind of went to a certain point and then like you can't get out. There's no link. You had to like leave the way you came in. There was a kind of an alleyway that led to the rivers of America, but it was not dressed well and whatever. There's another story about that. There was no Swiss Family Robinson treehouse in the early days. There was no New Orleans Square around the corner. There is a generous portion of the path at Disneyland and at Disneyland's Adventureland that wasn't there. It was an intimate little place, and the opening day attraction, the e-ticket, though it wasn't technically an e-ticket, was the Jungle Cruise. That was the must see, and it literally was three major attractions in the earliest days, which was the Jungle Cruise, which was a must see. Main Street USA, that was not a ticketed venue, but that was one of the biggest attractions there, that thoroughfare. And the Golden Horseshoe Review, which was the show that everybody had to see. So not a lot of going there. All the other rides were very intimate and not breakthrough, but those were the big ones. Those are the ones that made people go, wow. Adventureland. The main thing about early Adventureland is that the Pavilion Restaurant was a building that bridged Adventureland with Main Street. The building is still there, but it was basically you enter through the front doorways of a Victorian era, kind of summer house, and immediately you are going to the waterfront at Adventureland. So yeah, that was one building that served two lands. And so what do? You dress up the front of it to look like, turn of the century America. And you cover the rest of it with thatch and bamboo and old wood spikes and have it, lead to Adventureland. The interior of the building, schizophrenic and weird, don't even ask. But what happens is you're crossing over Adventureland Bridge into Adventureland, and what do you see? When two buildings have two different, dressings, what do you see? You see a seam, a big kind of zipper, where there's one kind of treatment on one side, and so what happens? Walt passes over that bridge every weekend over and over again, and of course he and his people are constantly aware of how that is not working. And long story short, and this is, Walt and his people were learning about, visual cross dissolves, and they were learning about how to move the eye through a space. And that was not working, along with many other things in the park. And they were attacking those one by one. So what do? They're like, if we put a building, if we stick a building on there in just the right way, you'll never know there's a seam there. So they had that idea for a building slash what? It'll be a cafe. It'll be a tea room. We don't quite know what this building's going to be, but we know we're going to stick one on there, and that will solve that problem. And from there, once the building was there, for a while it was just an open air space where you could listen to the Polynesian music at River's Edge. Then it became like a little cafe or a tea room, and then it just kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing until it became the Enchanted Tiki Room.
Wow, that's all to cover a seam. No,
yeah,
that's what I got there.
Yeah, that's one of the tributaries. There are so many other tributaries.
Oh, I know.
There's the fact that there's mid-century love for all things exotic and the tiki pop movement, and Hawaii becoming our newest state of the union, and the nation's already passionate love affair with Polynesia and the music. But yeah, that Adventureland building was very much a huge part of the story. Yeah.
Well, you preempted my next question. I was going to ask you about you did a good job with it. No, it's a perfect lead in the tiki craze, because I was born in 76. So the tiki craze, and I'm not saying you were, but you did a lot of research on this in the 50s and 60s and how it led in. So, and then Walt's interest, which, you never know, how quickly Walt grabbed on, but how did they ultimately then decide, okay, we want to grab onto this? And it's a big question. You could probably write a book on this, but why was tiki so big at that time in the United States? Or in the world, for that matter?
I think it was more an American invention. And very, very much, a part of the American. Yeah, I think it's pure America, and it's corny and silly and ridiculous.
Yeah,
and it was so part of the mid-century bachelor pad aesthetic. The idea of the music, how transporting it was. Now, I actually do two chapters. One that's called Tropical Hideaways, and one that's called Tiki Rooms, and they're two different stories, but they are kind of met. They do meet in the middle. But long story short, the big engine was post-war GIs coming back from the South Seas. Their experience was both horrific and enchanting. Like, both of those are real emotions, because these were lands and people that the GAs would never forget. The warm ocean breezes, the color, the light. They came from suburbia. Well, not suburbia. They came from small hometown America. And so this was a blast of something fantastic. So they came back with those memories. And then, of course, what does post-war America do? They move into the suburbs where basically it's cookie cutter homes and one giant parking lot that goes on forever. So having a place in your neighborhood that could take you to an exotic transporting place. These are places that were covered in bamboo and filled with the music and had the colorful lighting that came from these baubles from fishing nets, and so that they could feel in their own backyard a sense of escape that was delightful. And along with that came the idea of relaxed inhibitions and free love. It was kind of its own weird groovy hippie movement among those people. But then as the late 60s, early 70s start creeping in, they have kids, and these kids are looking at their dads and thinking, this is so corny and it's so wrong and it's so kitschy. These are people coming back from the Vietnam War now. These are people who are into a whole new lifestyle and and so of course, whatever dad did, uncool, right, and silly and rejected. So the tiki movement, the tiki thing, and again, it it fed into not only, drinking establishments, but bowling alleys and television shows and it was everywhere all at once. So all of a sudden that's not cool anymore. But voila, give it a few more years, come Pee-wee's Playhouse and SpongeBob
Mm.
SquarePants and the B-52s and this new rediscovery. That whole idea of everything old is new again, and that kooky, kitschy world of Tiki comes roaring back, and just in the nick of time for the Tiki Room at Disneyland, by the way, because a lot of people had started to drop off from finding that in any way charming. So yeah, that actually helped to resuscitate the Tiki Room at Disneyland as well. Yeah. So again, everything in cycles. Everything starts to loop. I still think we are enjoying a bit of the respect for the silliness of it, because out of that tiki craze came some really, really corny but charming sensibilities in art and music. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Because as you were talking, I was thinking, like, are we in more the upswing now? Because it seems like tiki bars, I mean, for a lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
younger adults even than me are a thing, but then others that are like my age but then like the Tiki Room to me, I feel like Disneyland even more than Disney World, but still, even at Disney World, I remember going in the 90s or whatever, and it was empty. Now it's like
Yeah.
people are liking it again. I mean, it's not like lines out the door, but it's fun. It's got a good vibe to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
It goes in. You just got to catch the right cycle so that attractions. We talked about
That's funny
Horizons.
yeah.
Attractions don't get killed at the wrong time, basically.
Yeah, and Horizons was killed at the wrong time. Bring it back, for God's sake.
It's just it ebbs and flows with leadership and everything. But go ahead, you were going to say something else.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I remember leaving the Tiki Room when I was, a student at Cal Arts, and someone said, or afterwards, and they said, "This was that's so charming." And I'm thinking, the word "charming" itself is one of those words that kind of feels like it comes in and out of coolness. Like,
Right.
how dorky to call something charming. But you know what? It's earned its charm. Like, it is charming. It is a handmade show. Like, you can see people feathering these things and wiring them up, and this sort of handmade relic from another era. And it is charming. It is charming, and it's some of its roots as far as the show itself goes go all the way back to vaudeville and even burlesque. So it's got that vibe. It's a really, really surreal show. It's so many different things thrown together. It's like it gets to a point where it's Monty Python-esque in its wackadoodleness, but that's part of its charm too.
Oh yeah, I mean even the accents of the people doing
Oh
it,
yeah,
like Wally Bogue and others, and you're like, well, I guess this is okay and everything. It's always on that edge of like,
yeah.
but
It's
still
okay.
charming.
It's
Yeah. But I wanted to make sure I asked you too. There's a big part of the book we haven't really talked about, which is kind of the history of like mechanical things that ultimately led through animatronics and all of Walt's attempts.
Yes.
Like there was the event with the So Dear to My Heart like cabin, which I'd never heard about before. There's just a lot of steps
Really?
that led to this. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm curious, I mean, I don't expect you to describe the whole book, but like the Tiki Room's role,
Yeah.
I think, is a little underplayed because I think a lot of people jump to Lincoln and they just talk about the Tiki Room quickly and go right to Lincoln. But the Tiki Room I know was so important too for animatronics.
Yeah. What's that? Book turned movie, Westworld.
Right.
A reaction to a park that had turned everything into a mechanical something. People would go. There was, a time where the in joke when you went to Disneyland was, you look at a squirrel running down and someone would go, well, that's just a mechanical squirrel. So yeah, Disneyland goes from, Jungle Cruise to a point where it's an in joke to just suggest everything that isn't human, and sometimes things that are human are mechanical. So But that stems from, again, Walt's childhood and his childhood link to later to mechanical toys that were enchanting to him that he bought for his family and himself. Later, an antique bird that tweeted out. So he was fascinated with all of that, like so many Americans were. The idea of this thing that's supposed to be inanimate, magically springing to life. So his love of mechanicals, later miniatures, totally, totally led to not only Disneyland, but right at the front door of the Enchanted Tiki Room. So he was pretty much from day 5 of Disneyland's run, thinking about, what about automated shows? What about, he loved the cast of the Golden Horseshoe, but he wasn't a fan of paying them, and he wasn't a fan of them having to take time off. And he wasn't a fan of the fact that, like human beings, they get exhausted. So he was always thinking, God, wouldn't it be great to have an automated show? You wouldn't have to pay them overtime, and they wouldn't fight back. You just pushed a button. And he was thinking about that from the early days of Disneyland, for an attraction that would later become, with General Electric's money, General Electric's Carousel Progress. That was going to be first an attraction at Disneyland, but then the World's Fair came along and it became Progress Land, and then it moved back to Disneyland. So Walt's primal love of that which comes to life and is not supposed to come to life becomes very much a part of Disneyland. And then that process was long and full of weird twists and turns. But come the Tiki Room, Walt being someone who loved other people's money, his engineers, later Imagineers, quickly find out that, the Defense Department actually has a way of recording and playing back motion. Can we get in on that? And boy, did they hit at the right time, because the government had already poured a lot of research into the Polaris missile system, and they had among other things, a testing device that was like a rocker that you could put a missile on and test it. So you could record the movements of the ocean and then play them back quite quickly. The Defense Department was on to other ways of doing that. So quite frankly, they had a garage sale, and when Walt and his people were like, we could use this stuff, the Defense Department was able to let go of it, and it became precisely what was needed to get something like the Enchanted Tiki Room up and running, which primarily was a 1-inch tape system where a lot of different frequencies could be recorded on tape, and those frequencies would trigger movements. So that came at exactly the right time. They had other animated creatures throughout Disneyland, but they were kind of cam systems that only had to have a run cycle of maybe 30 seconds, triggered by a passing vehicle. So if it's only a movement that has a limited cycle, you can do that with rotating cams like clockwork. But when you're doing a show where you've got characters that have to perform for 17 minutes, if you're going to use a cam system, those cams are going to be as large as Adventureland. They're going to be just giant swirling cogs in the middle of a parking lot. So this new tech was a huge breakthrough, and did something that, again, had never been done before in entertainment.
It's so interesting. It came from like a missile system, and that was like a key factor in making what it was. Yeah, because you reference in the book like the Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland, or even something like the Jungle Cruise that are so different. This is just next level. And then it wasn't lost even on writers at the time that, wait a minute, Disney is using tech from the Defense Department that, for the Defense Department, is meant to blow stuff up and kill people, and yet Walt is using it to put a smile on someone's face for the end product being joy. So that was not lost on even people of the time. Well, excellent. Well, I want to ask you too, for you personally. I mean, you finished this book that took 16 years. I apologize, not 10. But how has it impacted you to like go through this process of writing this book and releasing it? And you said it was the book you wanted to read. Now that it's out, how's it been for you to kind of see it in the world and talk to people like me and hear from listeners and everything else, or hear from readers and everything else?
It's been very, very, very emotional. I was writing this in the dark for a long, long time. And writing is, by its very nature, kind of lonely. It was a loneliness I loved. to a certain extent, certainly. But I remember, my first boss in animation was Brad Bird, and not because of his last name, but because he was the perfect person to write the foreword. I asked him, and he said yes. But it was, for me, I told him it was contingent upon him actually liking the book. Like so many A-listers, you go through their wives to get to them. And I count his wife, Liz, as a dear friend. She's a sweetheart. And so I was going through her, but I remember, and again, this is after years of hard work and no sense of validation. The book hadn't really gone out to anybody. I got a text. I woke up, I got a text, and it's from Liz, and she says, Brad's been reading your book, and he loves it. And knowing Liz, she put it all in caps. And I was shocked because my reaction was I started bawling. It was incredibly emotional. It was like, you know what? If Brad is the only person on the planet that liked my book, I'm good with that. But again, such a huge release and a real sense of like, oh, you know what? I wasn't just shooting blanks in the dark. Like, this is something. And since then, after I've been doing talks and signings and meeting people, I can't, there's no other way to put it. It's very emotional, very, very heartwarming and powerful and validating. Like, wow, I did this, because, it's hard work.
Oh yeah.
And people are responding to it and enjoying it and loving it and kind of getting it. So yeah, so very emotional. That's the only thing I can say.
No, I think that's perfect. Well, I got to tell you, I mean, I've read a lot of books about Disney attractions and stuff, and this one's up there. And you can really feel the amount of, like, I mean, every book, the writer, I feel like all these Disney books, the writers are into it, but you can really feel how much you put into the book. And
thank you so much.
I think it's great, but I think that's about the best ways we can end about the book. I did want to ask you too, though. We've talked all about Tiki Room. Are there other attractions? I mean, I'm not saying to write a book. I'm not going to ask you about that, because that's mean when you spent 16 years. But are other attractions you love, like on this level? I mean, even close to the Tiki Room at Disneyland or anywhere?
Oh, definitely Superstar Limo at California Adventure.
Of course.
Which is no longer there. That is a masterpiece. And it's too bad it's gone, because it was pure magic. All of those ABC TV stars smiling at you as you go by.
Drew Carey is there.
Drew Carey, what a master work. Someone like, what was it? Kevin Kidney said, because Kevin Kidney, who I mentioned earlier, is writing his own book that I can hardly wait to read, about a passion of his, which is the Swiss Family Robinson movie, which was the most popular movie that year, I think. When it came out, and he goes, Ken, what's your next book? You're going to write another book? And I was on the phone at the time, and I think I screamed at the top of my lungs, no! And he laughed because he gets it. He knows it's a process. I don't know. Do I have another attraction? They're all great. Like, how funny you bring up Horizons, because it really is one of their masterworks that's just no longer there. The fact that it's gone is so depressing, and that what they were like. Go ahead. If you're going to take something out, you better put something in that's even better. So what do they put in? A Vomatron. Like, yay, I get to throw up. Woo! As opposed to be, mesmerized and go into the future and believe that one day I might live in a undersea capsule and be happy, or in outer space. So good question. I right now I'm just going to enjoy this little break, and
oh yeah,
I get to talk to lovely, amazing people like you, which is so much fun. And we'll see how long it lasts, and then we'll see. But I did joke to Pete Docter at Pixar about, because he asked me, he's like, what's your next book? And I did say exactly that. I said, I'd like to write with a totally straight face, as if I'm absolutely serious, a book about the making of Superstar Limo.
I've talked to people that worked on that.
So I do feel like there's a book in there. Like, go ahead. Like, what does it feel like to work on something where, the truth of the matter is, Dan, like, I work on films and just as much hard work goes into making a piece of crap as often making a masterpiece. So a lot of work went into Superstar Limo, but it was a misfire, and a huge, like, holy, it's probably the worst thing they ever did. I can't imagine worse. God, even the parking lot before California Adventure was better than Superstar Limo. But just as much work went into the parking lot as that. But no, people did work hard on that, and it was and exploring why it was a misfire and why it should never be done. Like maybe write it as a cautionary tale. There you go.
I don't know. I mean, there's been documentaries, or people love things like The Room, or like there's documentaries on these terrible movies. It's kind of the same
Oh yeah,
idea, but it's a book on a theme park. I don't know.
yeah.
I'm just brainstorming now. This
I'm too. I'm throwing. I know.
well,
Maybe a book. I don't know. Whatever.
go ahead.
I was, when I was a cast member at Epcot, there was literally 12 hilarious stories every day about some dumb bozo at the park doing some dumb bozo thing, and someone should make a book out of that. But for now, I'm just delighted to sit here and yammer with you.
Oh, for sure. And I'm not pressuring you at all. I think the book's great, and the last thing I want to do is be like, yeah, that's good, but what's next? No, it's amazing. You should enjoy it, and I'm glad you're enjoying it and getting such great responses. And for listeners who haven't read it or anything, where should they go to learn more or pick up a copy or anything else? Like, where are good places for them to find out more about
the only place I am new to? This is a self-published book, so the best place for them to go is probably Amazon.com because they have plenty of copies there. I'm still kind of poking into brick and mortar places. Recently, the book was allowed to be on the shelves at the Walt Disney Family Museum, which is an absolute delight and so thrilling. But it's a process because there's a big machine behind a big phalanx of lawyers, and there's a machine there that makes it a little bit more difficult. So yeah, I'm still poking into brick and mortar stores, and that's another process that's going to take a few more weeks, maybe a couple months. But I do have a website as well. You can buy a copy there, like an autographed copy. That is very easy to remember, tikiroom63.com. If you forget the number, just try to remember the last two digits of the year the show opened, tikiroom.com. So yeah, and that's a good start. I'm about to be out of town, so when people do buy a book from the website, I have to be home, but I'm going to be in Europe for almost a month, so I'll put a note there. But you'll be able to get one in time for Christmas if you want one. So that's where to go. Yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, Ken, this has been really fun, and really enjoyed the book and enjoyed talking with you and learning more about it. So thanks so much for being on the show.
A total pleasure. Thank you, Dan. It was great to be here. And for the rest of you, if you haven't read the book, go get a copy. You'll be happy you got it. I promise.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, it was really awesome to talk with Ken and learn more about the Tiki Room and his book. Again, it's called Before the Birds Sang Words, and you can go to tikiroom63.com to check it out, or just buy a copy on Amazon. I promise you will not be disappointed. And can Brad Bird really be wrong? I don't think he can. It's really cool, and I'm glad I got a chance to talk with Ken. So we have 4 episodes left of the Tomorrow Society podcast. That includes episode 250. If you would like to submit a suggestion or question, some topic, I'd say a topic for me to talk about. I've already gotten some really good ones. You can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Say, hey, that's going to be the final episode. What do you want to talk about? Because I can ramble. Don't get me started. But I've already got some great topics. I'd love to hear what you think about it and have you guys all participate in what's going to be a celebration of 250 episodes of the Tomorrow Society podcast. But before that, we still have 3 more, and I'm still figuring out what those are. But I hope you enjoyed everything with Ken. Before we finish, I did want to talk a little more about how I'm feeling right now. I promise this isn't some big political statement. I want to be accepting of anyone who wants to listen to the show and loves theme parks. But if you've been listening for a long time, especially during the pandemic, you probably know my thoughts. But I will just say this, that I'm struggling, like many of us, and not as much. It's more, I mean, I understood what might happen and what did. And it's more about where do we go from here, I guess, is kind of the way. And I'm not thinking of in terms of any sports team analogy or, oh, my side or your side or whatever, just in terms of what's going to happen with the country and everything else. And the only thing I can think of is just try myself to really, I mean, I try to be a good person. I try to be nice to people, try to be a good parent, everything else. But I think even more zone in on that. And something I was already thinking about, partially related to ending the podcast, just trying to simplify things and focus, but to really zone in locally. It just happened to be was donating blood the day after the election. Not it was at my work, so it wasn't even intentional. But that felt good to do something like that. I think I'm going to really try to do that like every 8 weeks. And then just try to, just leave a positive mark where I can. I know that it doesn't mean we're putting our head in the sand or anything, but I think this is the way I'm looking at it. And I just want to relate it back to theme parks. I know you're like, Dan, why? This is a theme park podcast. Why are you talking about this? But it is, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm recording this just 2 days later on Thursday. So it's very, very fresh. The wounds are for me. But I think back to, when I talked to Don Dorsey, who is really one of the key figures behind some of our favorite nighttime spectaculars, Main Street Electrical Parade, Phantasmic, Illuminations, and Illuminations Reflections of Earth. And Don told me something that really struck me. He talked about when they were getting Reflections of Earth prepared. And I'd actually planned to play a clip, and I still probably will in episode 250 about this relating to the podcast, but now it kind of really fits for me. And he talked about the way he was thinking about for the millennium, for the new millennium and this show. And and the idea of We Go On, that song that's at the end, as you know, of Reflections of Earth. And he really brought up the idea of when we're on this earth, and I apologize, I'm getting a little serious, a little different, but hey, we're at the end of the show. This is what we're going to do. When we're on this earth, the idea is that each day when we wake up, we try to do something that makes the world a better place, or that somehow makes the world better than it was the day before. And I'm paraphrasing Don. I think he said it much more eloquently, but just the idea that whatever we're doing, whether it's a theme park podcast, whether we're, captaining a sports team, a teacher, whether we're running for office, just having lunch with a friend, whatever it is, that we're doing something or something to our life to try and make it a better place in some way than where it is before. And again, not relating to, this isn't really political at all to me. This is just the approach to life, but I'm feeling it a lot strongly based on uncertainty and concerns and everything. So I think I'm just going to do that. And just the idea of We Go On, or the idea of just, this is not everything's perfect, or we can't be sad, we got to be optimistic. It's nothing about that. We can be sad, we can be angry, we can have feelings about everything and where things are going and what happened. But just the idea that, okay, when how I'm choosing to spend my time, doesn't mean every second, doesn't mean I can't get stuck doom scrolling and everything else. But overall, the goal being how to think of it in terms of like, what are we doing to, not in some grand thing, but day to day, how are my interactions, whether it's saying hello to someone at a coffee shop, or whether it's something bigger with kids, parents, siblings, friends, whatever. That's the way I'm trying to look at it. I don't know. It's the best thing I can give you at this point, but I hope you enjoyed the break of just hearing Ken and I talk about the Tiki Room. I thought it was a fun show. I hope you did so too. I'm looking forward to finishing off this podcast in the next month or two and getting to the big episode 250 and kind of saying, here's the end of this project, and let's see where it goes. That's about all I got. Social media, I'm still out there at the Dan Heaton, but I don't know how often. I'm trying to spend less time online. but I'm out there, blue sky, especially. I may be gone from Twitter soon, Facebook threads, all video. If you want to connect, always shoot me an email. Love hearing from you. I really appreciated some of the really kind messages I've gotten, and of course the music you're hearing right now, written by Adam Hookey, performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Take care out there, and be excellent to each other, and just let's all try to come together in whatever way we can. I just mean person to person, whatever we can do. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, and talk to you next time.